I've been trying to write stories. I thought I was looking for better plots, stronger characters, and endings people would remember. It seemed straightforward. Then something unexpected happened. Every answer led to another question. A question about endings became a question about conflict. Conflict became friction. Friction became curiosity. Before I realized it, I was wandering through psychology, mythology, philosophy, neuroscience, and back again to storytelling. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking how stories work and started asking why they work. I didn't decide to change direction. One day, I simply looked back and realized I'd been following questions more than stories. I kept returning to that thought. The more I looked through my notebooks, the less they resembled a writer's notebook. They were filled with fragments, a sentence about mythology beside a note on brain chemistry, an observation about a fisherman leading to the hero's journey, a sketch of narrative structure interrupted by a question about meaning. None of it looked organized. For a while, I thought that was the problem. Then another possibility occurred to me. Maybe understanding doesn't arrive in order. Maybe ideas wander until one day they recognize each other. I remember thinking that if I could find the right structure, everything would settle into place. It was a comforting thought, as if there were a hidden key waiting to be discovered. The more I searched for it, the more the locks seemed to change shape. That's when another question appeared. What was I actually expecting stories to give me? I'd spent so much time trying to understand stories that I'd forgotten to ask why I cared about them in the first place. At first, the answer seemed obvious. Stories entertain us. They let us escape for a while. They take us to places we've never been and introduce us to people who never existed. Then I noticed something I couldn't explain. The stories that stayed with me weren't always the most exciting ones. Some were quiet. Some barely seemed to do anything at all. Yet, years later, they would return without warning, as if they had left something unfinished inside me. That's when I began wondering if stories were giving me something other than entertainment. Maybe they were leaving me with questions instead of answers. I couldn't leave that thought alone. If a story could stay with me for years, perhaps its real power wasn't hidden in the plot at all. Maybe it lived somewhere else. I started paying less attention to what happened inside a story and more to what happened inside me while I was reading it. Curiosity, uncertainty. A brief moment of clarity followed almost immediately by another question. The pattern felt strangely familiar. It didn't remind me of stories. It reminded me of thinking. For the first time, I wondered if stories weren't simply reflecting the mind. Maybe they were moving the way the mind naturally moves. Once that thought appeared, I stopped chasing certainty. For years, I believed understanding worked like a puzzle. Read another book, watch another lecture, learn another storytelling technique. Eventually, the picture would be complete. It never was. Every new idea answered one question and quietly created another. At first, that frustrated me. Then I began to wonder if the frustration wasn't a flaw in the process. Maybe it was the process. Perhaps understanding isn't a destination waiting somewhere ahead. Perhaps it's a landscape that changes every time we walk through it. That changed the way I looked at stories. I stopped asking whether a story was well written and started asking what it was doing to my mind while I experienced it. Some stories made me curious, others made me uneasy. A few stayed with me long after I'd forgotten their characters and even their plots. What remained wasn't a sequence of events. It was a different way of seeing. Somehow the story had rearranged something inside me. The pages had ended, but the thinking hadn't. That brought me back to something I'd been struggling with for years. Endings. Every time I reached the end of a story, I hesitated. Not because I couldn't invent another scene. I could always add another conversation, another revelation, another twist. The real difficulty was deciding what the story was finally saying. An ending isn't simply where events stop. It's where understanding comes to rest, even if only for a moment. That's when I realized I wasn't struggling to finish stories. I was struggling to recognize the moment when one question had changed enough to become another. Life rarely gives us that kind of ending. Questions don't disappear. They change. We answer them as best we can, live with those answers for a while, and then something happens that makes us question everything again. The pattern felt familiar. It was the same rhythm I admired in stories. A character believes they've found the answer. Something unexpected happens. The answer breaks open, revealing a deeper question beneath it. The story doesn't continue because the character failed. It continues because their understanding has outgrown the answer they once believed. That made me wonder why certain stories have survived for thousands of years. Gilgamesh, Odysseus, Romeo and Juliet. Countless myths carried from one generation to the next. We often talk about them as timeless stories, but perhaps that's only half the truth. Maybe they endure because they preserve something more fundamental than their plots. They preserve a pattern we recognize within ourselves. We think we know where we're going. We lose our way. We discover something. We mistake that discovery for the destination. Then life quietly asks us to keep walking. Perhaps these stories aren't preserving ancient events. Perhaps they're preserving an ancient movement of the human mind. That possibility changed the way I thought about narrative itself. I'd spent years looking for conflict, structure, character arcs, and satisfying endings. Now, another possibility appeared. What if every compelling story begins with something much simpler? A gap. A small distance between what we believe and what we have yet to understand. The moment that gap appears, something inside us begins to move. We ask questions. We look for patterns. We test ideas. We search for connections. Then, for a brief moment, everything fits, until another gap quietly opens and the journey begins again. Those moments are so ordinary that we almost miss them. A scientist notices a hidden relationship inside a page of numbers. A musician suddenly understands why a melody never sounded quite right. A child discovers how to balance on a bicycle without thinking about balance anymore. Even baking a loaf of bread can become one of those moments. The flour hasn't changed. The oven hasn't changed. The person hasn't changed. Yet, something has. The mind has quietly reorganized itself, and for an instant, the world feels more coherent than it did a moment before. We usually call that understanding. Perhaps we've been experiencing it all our lives without ever stopping to notice it. That thought kept leading me back to a single word: meaning. We speak about meaningful lives, meaningful work, meaningful relationships, and meaningful stories, as though everyone already knows what the word means. I wasn't so sure anymore. What exactly is meaning? Is it something waiting to be discovered? Or does it appear the moment separate experiences reveal the relationships that were always there? I started noticing the same pattern everywhere. A memory explained another memory. A sentence from a book illuminated something that had happened years before. An ordinary conversation completed a thought I didn't know was unfinished. Nothing new had entered the world. The pieces had been there all along. What changed was the way they suddenly fit together. Perhaps that's the thread I'd been following from the very beginning without realizing it. I thought I was learning how stories worked. Instead, stories were teaching me something about the mind. They weren't simply entertaining me or helping me escape. They were giving me opportunities to experience understanding itself. For a brief moment, the world became a little more coherent than it had been before. Then another question appeared, and the search continued. I used to think that was disappointing. Now I see it differently. Maybe stories aren't meant to end our search for meaning. Maybe they're meant to remind us that the search is one of the most human things we do. And perhaps that's why, after all these years, I'm still trying to write stories.